Aaron had never been particularly superstitious. As a groundskeeper for Pine Hollow Cemetery, he often laughed off the ghost stories that swirled around the old gravestones. He spent his days maintaining the grounds, trimming overgrown bushes, and ensuring that the resting places of the dead were tidy and respected. But it was his nights that were the most unnerving. The cemetery was expansive, with graves dating back to the 1800s. Ancient oak trees loomed over the tombstones, casting long, eerie shadows in the moonlight. Aaron's small, rundown cabin sat on the edge of the property, offering a view of the entire cemetery. It was a lonely job, but it paid well, and Aaron valued the solitude. One chilly autumn evening, Aaron was finishing his rounds when he noticed something strange. In the far corner of the cemetery, where the oldest graves were, a dim light flickered among the tombstones. Curious, he decided to investigate. As he approached, the light vanished, leaving only darkness and the rustling of leaves in the wind. He shrugged it off as a trick of the light, perhaps a reflection from a passing car. But as he turned to head back to his cabin, a faint whisper reached his ears. It was so soft he could barely make it out, but it sent a shiver down his spine. Aaron quickened his pace, trying to convince himself it was just his imagination. The following night, the light appeared again, this time closer. Aaron's curiosity was piqued, and he armed himself with a flashlight and a sturdy stick before venturing into the darkness. As he neared the source of the light, it disappeared once more, leaving him standing in front of a weathered tombstone. The name was illegible, worn away by time, but the date was clear, 1893. A sudden gust of wind blew out Aaron's flashlight, plunging him into darkness. He fumbled with it, finally getting it to work again, but the light felt weaker, barely cutting through the night. Aaron hurried back to his cabin, feeling an inexplicable sense of dread. Over the next few days, Aaron couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. He saw fleeting shadows out of the corner of his eye and heard whispers that seemed to follow him. Determined to get to the bottom of it, he began researching the cemetery's history. He discovered that in the late 1800s, a string of mysterious disappearances had occurred in the area. The townspeople had whispered about a malevolent presence in the cemetery, but nothing had ever been proven. One name stood out in the old records, Elias Thatcher. He had been a gravedigger, much like Aaron, but had vanished without a trace in 1893. Some believed he had been consumed by whatever haunted the cemetery. Aaron couldn't help but feel a connection to the long-lost gravedigger, as if their fates were intertwined. Determined to uncover the truth, Aaron decided to stay up one night and watch the cemetery from his cabin. As midnight approached, the familiar flicker of light appeared once more. This time, Aaron was prepared. He grabbed his flashlight and headed out, determined not to let the light escape him again. He followed it deeper into the cemetery, past rows of graves and twisted trees. The light led him to an old, forgotten mausoleum. The heavy stone door was slightly ajar, and a chill emanated from within. Aaron hesitated for a moment before pushing the door open and stepping inside. The air inside the mausoleum was damp and cold. Aaron's flashlight flickered, casting eerie shadows on the walls. At the far end of the room, he saw the source of the light, a single flickering candle placed on top of a stone coffin. As he approached, the whispers grew louder, forming words he could almost understand. He reached out to touch the coffin, but as his fingers brushed the cold stone, the candle extinguished, plunging him into darkness. Panic set in, and he turned to leave, but the door slammed shut, trapping him inside. The whispers grew deafening, and Aaron felt a cold hand grasp his shoulder. He spun around, but there was no one there. His flashlight died, and he was left in complete darkness, surrounded by the whispers of the dead. Aaron's heart pounded in his chest as he struggled to steady his breathing. The whispers seemed to seep into his very being, chilling him to the bone. He fumbled in the dark, searching for the flashlight, but it was nowhere to be found. In his panic, he realized he had no choice but to confront whatever was in the mausoleum with him. "Who's there?" Aaron's voice trembled as he spoke into the void. The whispers momentarily ceased, replaced by an oppressive silence. He felt a presence looming near, watching him, waiting for him to make a move. Summoning his courage, Aaron tried to recall the layout of the mausoleum. He remembered the direction of the stone coffin and began to inch his way towards it. His fingers brushed against the cold, rough surface of the stone, and he steadied himself, trying to think clearly. "Why are you here?" he asked, hoping for an answer. The whispers returned, coalescing into a single, coherent voice. It was faint, barely audible, but Aaron strained to hear it. "Free me," the voice implored. "End this curse." Aaron felt a chill run down his spine. "Who are you?" he demanded. "Elias," the voice replied. "Trapped. For so long." Aaron's mind raced. Elias Thatcher, the gravedigger who had vanished in 1893. Somehow his spirit was still here, bound to the cemetery. But how could Aaron help him? "How can I free you?" Aaron asked, his voice a mixture of fear and determination. The voice seemed to struggle, as if fighting against an unseen force. "Find the grave, my bones, buried beneath the tree." Aaron's heart sank. The cemetery was vast, and there were many trees. But he had to try. He felt along the walls of the mausoleum, searching for the door. His fingers found the edge, and he pushed with all his might. The door creaked open, and he stumbled out into the night, gasping for fresh air. The moon had risen high, casting a silver glow over the cemetery. Aaron knew he had little time before dawn. He grabbed a shovel from his cabin and set out to find the tree Elias had mentioned. He wandered through the cemetery, the flashlight his only guide. The ancient oaks loomed overhead, their gnarled branches reaching out like skeletal fingers. Aaron searched for any sign that might lead him to the right tree, but they all looked the same in the darkness. As he neared the center of the cemetery, he noticed a particularly large oak tree, its roots spreading wide and deep. Something about it felt different, almost menacing. He decided to start digging there. The ground was hard and unyielding, but Aaron dug with a fervor born of desperation. The whispers seemed to guide him, urging him on. He dug for what felt like hours, his muscles aching, his breath coming in ragged gasps. Finally, his shovel struck something solid. He cleared away the dirt, revealing a set of bones, long forgotten and buried deep. Aaron's hands trembled as he uncovered the skeletal remains. He knew instinctively that these were Elias's bones. Aaron heard the voice once more, clearer now. "Thank you," it said, filled with relief and gratitude. "But there's one more thing. The ring." Aaron's heart sank again. A ring? He hadn't seen any ring. Panic threatened to overwhelm him, but he forced himself to think. Where would a ring be? He glanced at the skeleton, noticing a glint near the bony fingers. He carefully brushed away more dirt, revealing a tarnished silver ring. It was simple but elegant, and Aaron sensed its importance. He picked up the ring, feeling its cold weight in his hand. "Is this it?" he asked. "Yes," the voice whispered, fading. "Place it on the coffin." Aaron raced back to the mausoleum, the ring clutched tightly in his hand. He burst through the door and approached the stone coffin. With trembling hands, he placed the ring on top, just as Elias had instructed. For a moment, nothing happened. Then a soft light began to emanate from the ring, growing brighter and enveloping the coffin. The oppressive darkness lifted, and the whispers ceased. Aaron felt a profound sense of peace wash over him. The light faded, and Aaron was left standing in the quiet mausoleum. He knew that Elias was finally at rest, free from his torment. Aaron took a deep breath and stepped outside, feeling the first rays of dawn on his face. As he walked back to his cabin, he couldn't help but feel that the cemetery, once a place of dread, now held a new sense of tranquility. He had faced his fears and uncovered the truth, and in doing so, he had not only freed Elias but also found a renewed sense of purpose in his own life. Oliver had always been a skeptic. Ghosts, spirits, and haunted places were mere figments of overactive imaginations to him. That was until the night he decided to spend in the old cemetery on the outskirts of town. The cemetery, Hilltop Rest, had been abandoned for decades. Overgrown weeds and ancient tombstones marked the resting places of people long forgotten. Local legends spoke of strange occurrences and unsettling sights, but Oliver dismissed these stories as superstitious nonsense. Determined to prove his point, he packed a flashlight, a notebook, and a camera, and set out just as the sun dipped below the horizon. The entrance to Hilltop Rest was a wrought iron gate, rusted and creaking with age. It groaned in protest as Oliver pushed it open. He paused for a moment, listening to the eerie silence that seemed to envelop the place. A chill ran down his spine, but he shrugged it off and stepped inside. The air was cool and damp, and the smell of earth and decay lingered. Oliver clicked on his flashlight, the beam cutting through the darkness. He made his way along the narrow paths, noting the names and dates on the tombstones. Some were so old that the inscriptions were barely legible, worn away by time and weather. As he ventured deeper into the cemetery, the sense of unease grew. The wind rustled the leaves in the trees, creating a whispering sound that seemed almost like voices. Shadows danced at the edges of his vision, but every time he turned to look, there was nothing there. Oliver reached a large, crumbling mausoleum at the heart of the cemetery. It was an imposing structure, with ivy-covered walls and a heavy stone door that was slightly ajar. He decided to investigate further. As he approached, he noticed that the ground around the mausoleum was disturbingly uneven, as if something had disturbed it recently. Pushing the door open with some effort, Oliver stepped inside. The air was stale and cold, and the darkness seemed to swallow the beam of his flashlight. He scanned the interior, noting the ornate carvings and the rows of stone sarcophagi. One in particular caught his eye. It was open, the heavy lid pushed aside. He walked closer, his footsteps echoing in the confined space. Peering inside the open sarcophagus, he saw that it was empty. The sight sent a shiver down his spine. He had read about grave robbers and vandals, but this felt different. There was something profoundly unsettling about the empty tomb. Suddenly, a faint noise behind him made him spin around. His flashlight flickered, and for a brief moment, he thought he saw a figure standing in the doorway. But when he blinked, it was gone. His heart pounded in his chest as he tried to calm himself. Determined to continue, Oliver took out his camera and began to take pictures, hoping to capture any evidence of what might be causing the strange disturbances. As he reviewed the photos, his breath caught in his throat. In several of them, he could clearly see shadowy figures lurking in the background, figures that hadn't been there when he took the shots. A sense of dread settled over him. He wanted to leave, but his curiosity pushed him onward. He moved deeper into the mausoleum, finding a narrow staircase leading down into what appeared to be a crypt. The air grew colder with each step, and the feeling of being watched intensified. At the bottom of the stairs, he found a small, dimly lit chamber. The walls were lined with ancient bones and skulls, and in the center stood a stone altar. On the altar lay a book, its cover made of cracked leather and bound with iron clasps. Despite the oppressive atmosphere, Oliver felt compelled to examine it. He reached out and opened the book. The pages were filled with incomprehensible symbols and diagrams. As he flipped through, a piece of paper fell out, landing at his feet. Picking it up, he saw that it was a letter, dated over 100 years ago. The letter was addressed to someone named Edmund and spoke of a ritual to summon the dead. It warned of dire consequences if the ritual were performed incorrectly, stating that the dead would not rest until they were avenged. Oliver's hands trembled as he read, and a cold sweat broke out on his forehead. Suddenly, the temperature in the room plummeted. His flashlight flickered and died, plunging him into darkness. Panic surged through him as he fumbled to turn it back on. When the light finally returned, he was no longer alone. Standing before him was a figure in tattered robes, its face obscured by a hood. The air around it seemed to shimmer with an unnatural energy. Oliver stumbled back, dropping the book and letter. The figure moved closer, and he could feel a malevolent presence emanating from it. "Who disturbs the rest of the dead?" A voice whispered, cold and hollow. Oliver couldn't find his voice to answer. The figure raised a skeletal hand, and the ground beneath him began to shake. Tombs and graves outside the mausoleum started to crack open, and he could hear the sound of earth being disturbed. He turned and ran, his heart pounding in his ears. The mausoleum door slammed shut behind him, but he didn't stop. He sprinted through the cemetery, the shadows seeming to reach out for him. Finally, he burst through the gate and didn't stop running until he was back in the safety of his home. Oliver never spoke of what happened that night at Hilltop Rest. He left the town soon after, unable to shake the feeling of being watched. But the nightmares never cease, and he knew that some things were better left undisturbed. Years passed, but Oliver's life was never the same. He moved to a new city, started a new job, and tried to bury the memories of that dreadful night. Yet the sense of dread remained. Every night he was plagued by the same nightmares, shadowy figures, whispering voices, and the cold, skeletal hand reaching for him. Despite his attempts to move on, the events at Hilltop Rest haunted him. He found himself constantly looking over his shoulder, and his once skeptical mind was now consumed with the supernatural. Desperate for answers, he began researching the history of the cemetery and the town it belonged to. He discovered that Edmund, the recipient of the letter he found, was a local occultist who had delved into forbidden rituals. Edmund's journals, preserved in the town's historical archives, spoke of a ritual to gain power by summoning restless spirits. However, something had gone horribly wrong. The ritual had unleashed a malevolent force, and Edmund had vanished without a trace. Determined to understand what he had encountered, Oliver tracked down Edmund's last living relative, an elderly woman named Margaret. She lived alone in a decrepit house on the outskirts of his new city, and reluctantly agreed to speak with him. "Edmund was my great-uncle," Margaret explained, her voice quivering. "He was obsessed with the occult. When he disappeared, our family was shunned by the town. They blamed us for the strange happenings, and we left in disgrace. Oliver showed her the letter he found, and her eyes widened in recognition. This is Edmund's handwriting. The ritual he attempted was supposed to summon spirits to do his bidding, but he underestimated the forces he was dealing with. The spirits turned on him, and he paid the ultimate price. Margaret paused, her expression somber. They say the spirits of Hilltop Rest are vengeful. They seek out those who disturb their rest, and they never stop until they've claimed another victim. Oliver's heart sank. He realized that he had unwittingly become their next target. Desperate for a solution, he asked Margaret if there was any way to appease the spirits. "There is one way," she said slowly. "You must return to the cemetery and perform a cleansing ritual. It's dangerous, but it might put the spirits to rest and free you from their curse." Armed with this knowledge, Oliver prepared himself for one final visit to Hilltop Rest. He gathered the necessary items for the ritual: candles, incense, and a book of ancient prayers Margaret had given him. As he stood at the entrance to the cemetery, he felt the familiar chill and sense of foreboding. The gate creaked open, and he stepped inside, his heart pounding. The cemetery was eerily silent, and the wind seemed to whisper his name. He made his way back to the mausoleum, the memories of that night flooding his mind. Inside, the air was just as cold and oppressive as before. He set up the candles around the altar, their flickering flames casting long shadows on the walls. Lighting the incense, he began to chant the prayers, his voice trembling. The ground beneath him began to shake, and the air grew colder. Shadowy figures appeared around him, their eyes glowing with a malevolent light. But Oliver continued the ritual, pouring all his fear and determination into the words. The spirits drew closer, their whispers growing louder and more frantic. He could feel their cold breath on his skin, but he refused to stop. The candles flickered wildly, and the shadows seemed to dance to the rhythm of his chant. Suddenly, a blinding light filled the mausoleum. The spirits recoiled, their forms dissolving into the air. The ground stopped shaking, and the oppressive atmosphere lifted. The candles burned steadily, and the air grew warmer.